Speak very briefly. You've had a chance this morning to hear a few reflections on New Zealand's current status as we confront the national security challenges that are facing many nations, including our own. One of the commitments we've made as a government is to be more open about the national security challenges that we face. The National Security Insights briefing has been released today. It's been prepared by government agencies, independent of government, to provide a bit of an insight to the challenges, not just in the next 3 years, but in the next decade. Accompanying that work, agencies have developed a survey of public perceptions around the risks that we face. That will provide a benchmark for us. Their intention is to continue that survey in future years. It gives us an insight into those national security issues which New Zealanders are most concerned about, but also those which they feel best prepared for. It gives us a sense of those areas where we do need to make sure that we're providing greater information and tools to New Zealanders to ensure that they feel better prepared for the challenges ahead. Interestingly, mis and disinformation registers highly as a concern for members of the public. They want to know more about what they can do to protect themselves and their loved ones. And there is a role for us to play in government, but there's also a role for civil society, academia, the media and others. They also identify transnational organised crime as a challenge that they are concerned about as well, and cybersecurity threats. That's another area where we see a role for us to play, ensuring that New Zealanders are better equipped or have the tools they need to protect themselves and others from cybersecurity threats. And it's work that's quite actively underway by the GCSB and CERT New Zealand. Speaking specifically to the subject matter here today, you will have heard in the second half of my speech some of the work that we've been actively doing over the past 3.5 years to make sure that New Zealand is better prepared to prevent and respond to the threats of terrorism and violent extremism. One of the things that's been very clear to us is that a very bespoke response is needed. Just picking up off the shelf other countries' initiatives on counter-terrorism will not be an appropriate response for New Zealand. We do need to increase our research base, and it's one of the reasons establishing the Centre of Excellence was so important. We also need to make sure that we have a bespoke response that identifies and acknowledges that radicalisation is often very individualised. And so having a range of measures and involving a range of different community groups, working alongside them and seeking their support to identify when radicalisation and potentially violent extremism may occur. Very happy, though, now just to take your questions after that really quick overview. And, of course, I have the Minister in charge of those security agencies with me today as well.
How do we balance things like national security with civil liberties concerns such as privacy and free speech? How do we make sure that we're getting that balance right so we're not becoming, a sort of totalitarian security state or anything like that?
I think one of the things that's unique to New Zealand is that we've looked around the world at national security responses and responses to counter-terrorism, being really clear that actually, not in all cases, taking a securitised response isn't always the best response. We have to make sure that we are looking at every level. So working alongside communities to help them be better equipped and understand what are the early signs of potential radicalisation and potentially the pathway to violent extremism, and making sure that we're equipping them and that we have the tools available for those different organisations and groups to help us respond. And then making sure that we have a broad spectrum of response at every stage. But at the fore for us is making sure that our response is very much a New Zealand response. We've not naturally been inclined, of course, to be a country that believes in mass surveillance. We protect and guard deeply our privacy, our freedom, our liberties, but we also have a duty of care to keep people safe. Our response is about making sure we're protecting both.
Prime Minister, is the government considering any novel approaches to combat misinformation? Apart from the Christchurch call, and apart from, you've ruled out censorship, what else can be done?
It is such a complex area, and it's an emerging challenge. I think one of the things we've identified is that whilst, of course, government has a role to play, our view is that if government sits front and centre of this response, it could be counterproductive. We need to involve all those who have a deep interest in making sure that our communities are resilient to mis and disinformation, and that all those who are affected by it have a voice and a role to play. Whilst I haven't got any formal announcements to make today, we have been having conversations as a team around how do we build a collective of those with an interests, civil society, academia, media, local government, to make sure that we're coming together to produce a response, to have a program of work and have better research and understanding of how dis and misinformation is affecting New Zealanders. What the survey we have today tells me, though, is that New Zealanders want us to do this work. They are concerned about mis and disinformation. It's not about censorship. It's about equipping people to identify when they may be subject to questionable information, making sure we're building our resilience in our young people to identify it and be able to synthesise that information themselves, and to create trusted sources where people know they can go.
This week has heard a lot about hate speech and the impact that is having on minority groups. You spoke about the importance of people feeling like they belong. So how's hate speech law progressing, and do you think it will remove those aggressive tweets and shouting on the street that people have spoken about here?
Well, first thing I would say is that amending hate speech laws is only one measure. One thing we heard very clearly in the aftermath of March 15 was the ability of the community, when they were experiencing really deeply troubling behaviour, threatening, potentially violent behaviour, making sure that they had a place where they knew they could go, where that was responded to adequately by our enforcement and by the law. And that is also incredibly important as part of the work we're doing. So that's been one of the responses too. On hate speech, you'll know that we went out with a consultation on proposals on hate speech, and it generated a significant and strong response. There were those who were strongly in favour, often those engaging face-to-face, and then there were a significant number who may have responded in writing who had deep concerns about whether the measures went beyond the intent of the Royal Commission. Our view is we need to find a way through. Our laws, as it stands, do not cover religion, and I think most people would argue that that means that there is a significant gap in them. We're looking to find a solution, and I believe there is one, and I believe there's one that we can get good cross-party support for.
Could you please elaborate a bit more specifically on what can be done to prevent terror threats in New Zealand?
Well, of course, we have to make sure that we're not only dealing with the root causes of those who may be enticed towards terrorism or violent extremism. And so, as I say, that is deeply individualised, and it's not ever fair to say that it comes from one specific set of ideologies. So, in a way, we need to be neutral on that and make sure that we have a response that tells people what are the signs that someone may be becoming radicalised, rather than just focusing on ideology. Recently, you'll have seen the NZHRL has produced a toolkit to enable people to help identify some of those common precursors, so that we're then able to ensure there is an intervention early on to try and ensure people take a pathway away from radicalisation. Then there are a number of other measures, making sure that we have appropriate measures to prevent risk around crowded places, for instance, making sure that the police, the NZHRL and the GCSB have the intelligence gathering tools that they need as a preventative measure. It's about being prepared across the spectrum, no matter where on someone's pathway they may be. Minister, is there anything further you want to say on that?
Not much more I would add, but I think a lot of work has gone into that, identifying with individuals their proneness to buying into misinformation and therefore being radicalised on the basis of, very, very weird sort of views. I think the other finding that the agencies discovered was that ideology is not the critical factor. It's going online to particular groups and engaging in forms of conversation that are often dehumanising, and it's then translating into sort of the physical conduct out and about, engaging with groups or going to places where people think it's okay to express not just radical ideas, but actually deeply harmful ideas. Seeing that and understanding that that might be indicative of a move to unhealthy radicalisation, that's what the toolkit that the USIS has put together is about.
You would have heard me talk as well about the Countering Terrorism Strategic Framework, which will be releasing, which has those 4 thematic areas around how to make an intervention around someone's pathway to radicalisation. It's not enough to say, though, that it's just about providing communities with ways to identify those concerns. We've also produced funding to support communities who may have their own initiatives that they believe can help with specific needs. So bringing those two kits together, the information people need, but also the funding to help support potential measures to counter those issues.
You talked about transparency a lot, and New Zealanders being more aware of these threats that are facing them. Why hasn't this been the case in the past?
Do you know, I think probably in the past there's probably been a view of talking openly about every threat that exists may unnecessarily cause anxiety amongst our population when, of course, naming every threat doesn't mean that they will occur. And I think we're far enough along in our journey as a nation where we understand that actually listing them doesn't mean it will happen, where people are more willing perhaps to talk openly about those threats and are able to moderate any sense in their own mind of how likely it is that they'll occur. I think we have to walk away, make sure that we aren't afraid to talk about those risks so we can prepare for them, because that in itself helps deal with any potential anxiety. One thing I'll also add, over the past 5 years, New Zealand has gone through a lot. We've experienced many of the significant issues that are already on our list of national security risks. So we understand them because we've been through them. I think we're very well placed to have open conversations around what those risks are and how we can all better prepare for them.
Can you elaborate on that Russian disinformation of 2021? How significant was it?
The research that's been produced by Microsoft, which surveys across the Pacific region, is very marked. Of course, there are some limitations there, but even then what it identifies is that New Zealand has been subject of significant amounts of Russian disinformation, focusing on two areas, COVID-19 disinformation and disinformation around the war in Ukraine. I would argue that New Zealand is, for the most part, very resilient towards disinformation, but we cannot take that for granted. And we've seen the byproduct, I think, of when disinformation can occur and where it can lead. It causes devastating effects, and I know many families who are being impacted by disinformation, and I expect that's why it's come up so strongly in the survey.
On Russia, an Auckland woman has raised $43,000 for the Russian army to invade Ukraine. Is the government going to intervene to stop her fundraising for Russia?
Look, I'm not actually in a position to give too much comment on that. I've seen the story this morning. Perhaps the Minister might have something more on it. But look, I've seen the story, but I don't have much more on it at this point.
There's a set of sanctions in place that may well deal with some of the practical elements of what she wants to do.
What I might do is just do a double check on where that would fall within our regime and come back to you.
You talk about the ongoing role of the Christchurch core, of which Twitter is one of the key things.
Yes.
Which you may have noticed has come under new ownership recently.
Yes.
And the new owner, Elon Musk, yesterday, I think, tweeted misinformation from a fake news site. Are you concerned about that relationship? Are you looking to engage with Elon Musk?
Twitter is one of the organisations that has been deeply involved in the Christchurch Call to Action, and to date has been a really constructive partner. Whilst I haven't had any opportunity to engage directly with Mr. Musk, I think the point that I would make here is, social media and platforms like Twitter have a huge responsibility. They can be a force for democracy, a force for connection and for good, but also, if misused, can do a huge amount of harm. My hope would be that he would stick strongly to the principle of transparency. Because that is one of the things that he's claimed that he is focused on. We are too. Algorithmic outcomes is an area where we need more transparency, we need more research, and we need more insights into the way that people's online experience is curated. So I'll use that as our starting point, but it's fair to say we are in a bit of unknown territory at this point.
When we sort of start to see people going down these pathways, is it important that we take a community approach to that to ensure that they're not going right to where they're actually coming to? Is it important
first and foremost, absolutely. I think a distinctly New Zealand response is to first and foremost focus on what can we do to make sure that we have resilience in our communities. What can we do to build greater understanding? And I'm loath to use the word tolerance, but that is what's most frequently referred to. Rather than tolerance, I prefer a celebration of the diversity of New Zealand. Those are the really strong foundations that we need. When you do, however, see situations where people are becoming radicalised, dehumanising others, being motivated by what we would all tend to regard as essentially hate, what interventions do we have? Now, of course, we want to make sure we have a broad spectrum. Jumping straight into a securitised approach is not always going to be the most successful option. So that's why we have to make sure we've got tools across the board, but starting with communities themselves, being able to identify and help intervene, particularly when it comes to radicalisation. That will often be a more successful measure too. All right.
Well, can I ask a question about...
Joel, do you mind if I just come to Fish, and then I'll flick over to you, and then we might finish with Minister Little.
The survey suggested that public stock community agencies have all the resources that they need, or perhaps the legislative support. What's your feeling on that?
Look, I think there's two things here that are clear. Firstly, New Zealanders have told us they don't feel they know enough from our agencies. And so I take that as a really important starting point. They don't feel like enough information is being shared. Now, I know New Zealanders will be really pragmatic and appreciate that we won't share every piece of information. It does somewhat undermine the idea of a national security and intelligence agency. But I think what Kiwis are essentially asking for here is a greater transparency around the reach of those agencies, the work that they do, how they're keeping Kiwis safe. I think in doing that offers up an opportunity to demonstrate that our agencies are well and properly resourced. They are not resourced for mass surveillance, but nor is that what New Zealanders want. So I think in providing that greater transparency around the work our agencies do, which a lot has been done to improve that over the past few years, I think we'll continue to get that assurance for the public. But Minister, you spent a lot of time thinking about this.
Yeah, and there's been quite significant additional investment in our agencies. It started under the previous government, in fairness, and we've continued that, and we've added to what they've done. It's not just expanding the workforce because of the nature of the work that they're doing, but adding to the kit that they've got. So we're always looking for opportunities with them to make sure that they've got the support they need to do the job to keep New Zealanders safe.
In terms of numbers, are these newly identified political radicals, extremists, are they on top of the previous two groups that we had, the white and the faith-based ones? You know, you've got a third group that was identified about 6 months ago. Is that on top of everybody else? Is that like...
But what I'm confident of is that the agencies are dealing with all forms of extremism and therefore the threat of terrorism, so they are across all those. But the nature of our agencies is, they're not monitoring the entirety of the internet. That's why things like their booklet on the indicators of potential extremist activity is so important, because actually we all have a responsibility to see what's happening. Our agencies are dependent on leads, either that they generate or that they are provided to them. That's the way in which they keep abreast of what is happening.
I think it would be an error for any agency to focus in on solely the motivating factors, be it political, be it religious, be whatever it is that's motivating someone to violent extremism, because those will change over time. And in some cases, there'll be individuals right now who are radicalised who have moved between different forms of motivation for that radicalisation. So what's really important, I think, is that we have that broad focus on what are the precursors, what do we use to identify when someone's becoming radicalised, and that we take a neutral approach on what it is that's actually motivating them in the first place, because it will keep changing. What's really interesting is that even the likes of the Dunedin study, going back, tracking across someone's life course, is identifying common themes between those who may be more motivated by things like conspiracy theories. It tells us a little bit about what are the things we can do to build resilience to that early on in people's lives. It's actually just about empowering individuals and ensuring that they are resilient in the same way that countries like Finland having to do this for years.
Prime Minister, on
I'll make this the last one.
Just can you please say your thoughts on, should we be relaxing the rules that determine who's a visitor visa from the Pacific, given our special relationship with them?
We've certainly made a significant number of changes to the way our immigration system works to make sure that those who have the skills that New Zealand needs right now are able to enter New Zealand quickly and easily and stay for the longer term. When it comes to the entry of the visitor visa, we've had processes in place for a number of years just to make sure that people are genuinely visitors. There have been calls from Pacific Island leaders over a number of years around whether or not their special relationship should mean that we treat those entries differently, and we do have some specific immigration initiatives that are only for the Pacific. But whilst we keep up those conversations with our Pacific counterparts and leaders, we haven't got any current plans in train, but we have been talking about what more we might be able to do.
Minister, are you satisfied your non-fatal strangulation support for victims is working the way it was intended to?
Well, actually, technically, neither of us are the responsible ministers. What I wouldn't mind is just if I could refer you to Marama Davidson, here based in Auckland. She'll have specific things to say, I'm sure, on the additional funding we provided to support medical examiners in court, to support those particular changes in law, and also the support to provided for victims in court, which we've also funded. Thanks. Okay, thanks, everyone.